Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Redman and welcome to another episode of Pastor's Library. This is the channel where we talk about everything to do with theology books, books that might be on a reading list for your seminary course or for your bachelor's or master's degree in theology or in biblical studies, or perhaps just books that have piqued your interest online or even when sat in your own pastor's library. So there is a lot to say about books. They cost a lot of money and buying them is a big commitment. So any comments you wish to make, any questions, please leave them below. You're very welcome. I like to hear from you and I will try to get back to you. But above anything else, if you like what we have to say today, please leave us a thumbs up. Please also subscribe and click on the bell if you haven't done already. All of these things help the algorithm. What more can we say with that? So I want today to talk about biblical theology. For those of you that have asked, you know this is for you. As a Christian, I've always been aware of systematic theology. And fundamentally, I have got an embarrassingly large choice of systematic theology books. And I'm going to be doing an update on those in the near future. But realistically, systematic theologies, if we're very blunt, are more about doctrine, they're more about putting together a worldview for Christians, they're more about us seeing what the author believes and how he puts that all together. So, for example, you get quite different systematic theologies written by Calvinists and free will theists. And you get quite a variation of them. Now, when I was at Bible college doing my master's degree, I remember one of the tutors saying, well, really, we shouldn't be looking at the Bible systematically for doctrine. We should be looking at it to see what it actually says. Let Matthew be Matthew, let Mark be Mark. And the analogy went on. And I think that what biblical theology is trying to do is trying to just put together for us the big story that God is trying to get over to us. And of course, the same is true as with the systematic authors. What you believe, what you bring to the scriptures is shown in what you write. I'm not saying that the scriptures don't influence that, but one's own worldview is reflected in your writings. So biblical theology is actually quite important. It's not anywhere near as old an idea as systematic theology. I mean, systematic theology, if you want a really good one that's still in use, then I would say you would go to Calvin's Institutes. And obviously that's 400 years old. There are lots of other semi-systematics that go back right into the early church fathers, and there are lots of other examples. But of course, everyone's having a go these days. But with biblical theology, because it's not been a thing for that long, there are fewer ones to look at. And there are people like Mead and Childs, and there's one in the mid 20th century that's got something to offer. But really, biblical theology has only really been going for 75 years, possibly, depending who you would put down as the first one. So, just a couple of ideas to start with, reading about biblical theology before we read biblical theology. One is Edward Klink and Darian Lockett wrote Understanding Biblical Theology. This was published in 2012. It's 193 pages. And what this does is it has a series of essays on different issues about biblical theology, what it is and it isn't, and the different perspectives on which it is written. Now, actually, I found this quite helpful. And to give you an idea, there is biblical theology as historical description, and biblical theology as the history of redemption, biblical theology as worldview story, biblical theology as a canonical approach, and biblical theology as theological construction. And then there's a summary chapter, Understanding Biblical Theology. Now, all I would say about this is, whereas I'm not saying this is the definitive book, this actually is a good pre-read before you get into biblical theology. And I found it helpful. I was very caught up on the biblical theology as worldview story, which is an overview of N.T. Wright's writing. And I did like that. There's biblical theology as canonical approach. There's one chapter that's the definition, and then the Brevard Childs is the second chapter on the subject. And Brevard Childs is often looked upon as really sort of turning the tide in the striving to produce a good biblical theology. So that's definitely a worthwhile read. There is also Introducing Biblical Theology by Sigurd Grindheim, which I do hope my pretend attempt at Norwegian emphasis made that something like correct. If not, I apologise to you, sir. This was published in 2013. It's 267 pages. And this is quite remarkable. He really splits this up into serious subjects, and he has some great titles like The God Who Interacts, which drew me in immediately. But then I found this to be very reformed. And I suppose, really, when you see the authors from Norway, Norway does tend to imply a strong Reformed emphasis or a very strong Pentecostal emphasis. You seem to get one or the other coming from Norway. But despite some stringent no-nos, in my opinion, this is definitely a worthwhile pre-read before getting into biblical theology. Besides which, if you do come from a Reformed background, you'd absolutely love this. So that's just a couple of pre-read things. Can I say that I've tried to just bring you 5 books today. There are loads of other things we could have gone into. We could have gone into Old Testament theology, New Testament theology. Now, I've got quite a lot of books on those, and we will go through them at some stage. But the idea of the one-volume biblical theology seemed to me to be the response to questions that I've had thrown at me. So I wanted to go there. Now, the newest biblical theology that I have got is by Andreas Kostenberger and Gregory Goswell, and it's just simply called Biblical Theology, a Canonical, Thematic and Ethical Approach. Now, I always think of Kostenberger as a Reformed theologian, which I think from reading this he definitely is. My first contact with him was I got the very, very first generation NIV study Bible. I would have think in the mid-80s, I'm not really sure. All I can tell you is it's fallen apart and unfortunately ended up in the bin long ago because I wore that out. And Kostenberger wrote an awful lot in that Bible, in that study Bible. Now, I picked this up, A, because it was reasonable, and B, because I sort of had a little bit of respect for Kostenberger. This is written definitely from a Reformed perspective. And I would suggest to you, if you're coming at this from a Reformed perspective, this must be a really good biblical theology for you. And I do like it. And as a person who is not coming from a Reformed theology, I still like this book. It has some very, very good points. I just think he misses some of the points, that's all. Now, what I would say about this is his approach is to try and follow his subtitle of a canonical, thematic and ethical approach. And you will see him coming back to those points through the book. He talks about the nature of biblical theology from his point of view, and then he compares biblical with systematic theology. And as you go through this, he'll talk about hermeneutics, and he'll then go over to the Old Testament framework. Now, there he's looking at the order of the books in the Old Testament, and perhaps what the Jews would consider is the order, the groupings of them. He goes on to the law and the prophets and the writings. He then moves on to the New Testament. So he's taking his biblical theology approach from the order of the biblical books. And he has, just like he has in the Old Testament, he breaks them down into groups like the letters of Paul, the general epistles, Gospels, and so on. And finally, he has a very, very long conclusion which talks about unity and diversity in biblical theology, talks about biblical themes in the Old Testament, themes in the New Testament, themes in the entire Bible, biblical ethics, the ethics of the New Testament and of the entire Bible, the biblical storyline, and then for the conclusion of his conclusion, because that literally is what it is, he talks about the future of biblical theology. Now, I have to say this has got a great deal of detail. It's a very, very organised approach, and you can't fault him for that. I think it has a lot to offer, and its clarity is quite remarkable. Published in 2023 with 981 pages, this is a hefty volume. And whereas you will find that those people recommending it are, again, generally from a Reformed background, I would not dismiss this, particularly if, like me, you managed to get a brand new copy quite reasonably. But it is definitely a Reformed product. Now, someone who is best known perhaps for his 3-volume work on Old Testament theology, which is quite remarkable, John Goldingay has published in 2016 a 608-page biblical theology of his own, which is subtitled The God of the Christian Scriptures. Now, this has some really good endorsements. Richard Borkham, Scott McKnight, Richard S. Briggs. These are top people recommending it. And I have to say that I found this much more engaging than some of the things that I've read of Goldingay's. And actually, if I'm honest, I have quite a lot of his books. But this seems to have been written because when he wrote his Old Testament theology, he had a voice in his head saying this ought to be a biblical theology. So it seems that writing one was the inspiration to write the other. Again, he makes this point about defining biblical theology, and that is clearly an important point, whatever you're reading on the subject. But he breaks this down into God's person, God's insight, God's creation, God's reign, God's anointed, God's children, God's expectations, and God's triumph. It also has a substantial bibliography of works consulted and a scripture index and a subject index, as you would expect. Now, when it comes to John Goldingay, you cannot critique the massive impact he has had on the theological world. And he really has left a big footprints. This is a great man with a great work. I'm not sure I always agree with his viewpoint on some things, but I do think there's a lot to gain from reading him. And this book, which is 2/3 of the size of Kostenberger's, I think personally this is a lot better. I think it offers a lot more. Now, I would suggest to you that is not because it's it's not reformed, because whereas Kostenberger might call himself reformed, I'm not sure that John Goldingay does, but he does have Calvinistic views. And I actually really liked this book. I think it's a great resource. I think you would get an awful lot from it, whatever viewpoint you came to it carrying. And I think that it's also not unreasonably priced, but it's one to look for. If you got this on the second-hand market, I would just suggest if it's a good price, don't think about it. It's a really good buy. Just snap it up. So that's John Goldingay, Biblical Theology. The one that I absolutely love, and I have to say I could barely put this down, is Biblical Theology, The Convergence of the Canon by Ben Witherington III. Now, I got to come clean here. I am a huge fanboy of Ben Witherington. I think there is almost nothing he writes that I can argue with. From his great Kindle book that he wrote about the death of his daughter and dealing with that, all the way through to his huge tomes on some of the commentaries he's written. And I mean, he really is quite profound. I mean, he's written a commentary on every book in the New Testament, and he's now taking bites out of some of the Old Testament books as well. This was published in 2019. It's got 495 pages, and in this, I feel like I am sat at the feet of my old granddad, who is telling me how the world works. And he's doing it in a very tender, loving way. I absolutely love Witherington's manner in general. And in this book, it's a delight to listen to him. When I say listen to him, I've watched him a few times on YouTube. I've listened to a few audio recordings of him. And I can sort of imagine his voice reading this to me. And it is quite remarkable. And for a man that got his PhD, I think, in England, we're very grateful for the little bit of input that we had into him. So this, again, starts off really with trying to define what biblical theology is. But his introduction is quite substantial and really is a definite read. I would suggest don't even start until you've read the introduction, because he really does lay out the design tracks for what he is going to put on the page. Now, what I would say about this is that some of the titles of the chapters, slightly wacky, others are absolutely engaging. He's got the God of the burning bush, the God of Golgotha, the God of the burning heart. He has a couple of chapters on stories in the Bible, and he has this great chapter where the Reformation went wrong, and there's also a chapter dealing with a conversation between two theologians, which is not common, but it's very good. And he has this idea of the threefold chord of theology, praxis, and ethics, and whereas that's not too dissimilar really to Kostenberger's idea, I would suggest to you he really does tie it up very, very well. Now, what can I say about this? For me, this is the ideal biblical theology. It's not about telling me what I should believe and then putting out groups of essays to explain that to me. It's about God's story through the Bible and what God is telling us to believe. And I really think that Witherington has done a sterling job on this. Now, I know there are other biblical theologies out there. And again, there's an issue in here about biblical theology and biblical theology as two separate concepts. But this is, to my mind, the ideal start. Now, if you don't like reading free will theists, get Kostenberger or get Golden Gay. But this, to my mind, if you are from a free will point of view, Witherington is not only the best, he's also the best. And so I really, really recommend this one. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I just feel that Witherington is great at big pictures. He's great at taking huge swathing narratives and summing them up into a paragraph and then into a sentence. And I think that's a huge gift. He really is a gift to the church. And if you want to really feel that you understand biblical theology, then this volume by Ben Witherington, which at the time of me filming this is 5 years old, so this is going to be quotable for the next quarter of a century, folks. This is a brilliant volume to start with. So in the future, I'll talk about Old Testament theology, I'll talk about New Testament theology, but for the big picture, I've tried to give you 3 examples, one of which should suit everybody, but for me, Biblical Theology by Ben Witherington III is my top pick, without a doubt. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you just want to make sure you keep in touch with us, make sure you've clicked on the bell. And of course, subscribe if you haven't done already. Leave us a thumbs up if you think what I've said today has been remotely acceptable. And thank you so much for supporting this channel. You have no idea what it means to an old pastor like me. So until next time, folks, God bless you and bye.